Today we're going to assemble the lower end of the 305 GMC V6. As you can see, we've got this thing together. So I'm going to go ahead, I've pieced together a bunch of video that we did earlier today when we assembled this, and I'm going to walk you through the rebuild. Let's get started. Okay, so another thing I'd like to point out here is this. As far as lubing the piston, of course we've got our bearing in here. As far as lubing the piston, I like to use WD-40 on the piston skirts and rings. Now let me explain to you why. A lot of people kind of freak out when I tell them that. But here's the thing. Total Seal, again I keep mentioning Total Seal, that's the people that made our ring compressor here. They specialize in piston rings. They're one of the largest piston ring manufacturers in the world. And they recommend WD-40 on rings and pistons. And the reason they recommend that is because the crankshaft in the engine, as soon as the engine fires up, is going to sling all kinds of oil up on the piston pin and the cylinder walls and so forth. It slings it up there, you know, pretty rapidly. And so you're not going to have a lack of oil once you start this thing. The problem with putting a lot of thick assembly lube, I've seen guys take real thick assembly lube and put it all over the rings and the piston. The problem with a thick layer of oil on the rings and the skirt is that the rings have to cut through that layer of oil before they actually grab the crosshatch and start sealing. Well, one of the issues with that is this assembly lube that's on here is going to get superheated by the ignition. If you have a thick layer of oil or a barrier of thick oil or assembly lube between the ring and the cylinder wall, that oil will actually bake instantly. It will start to burn and bake, and it can actually, when that piston's zinging up and down in there, even at low RPMs, it can actually glaze the cylinder walls and do damage to your crosshatch, which is going to hurt cylinder sealing. So they say just a very light coating of oil. In fact, if you're going to use engine oil, use a very light engine oil, and you should just dab a little oil on the rings and the skirt. You shouldn't have not even one drop of oil falling on your drip tray. Some guys will take and dip this in a coffee can full of oil. That is the worst thing you can do when you put these together. You don't ever want to do that. Total Seal, the largest performance ring manufacturer in the world, recommends WD-40 on here. I've been using WD-40 on rings and pistons for years. Once I was told that from them, and never had an issue. Works great. But I've actually seen engines where there was a lot of thick assembly lube on here have problems with ring seal because the cylinder walls were glazed. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we got our piston. One of the things that you want to do is stagger your ring end gaps. So if you look at the ring end gaps here, I'm going to line all these up so you can see them. So the rings have gaps, at least these do, because they're not gapless rings. And in this case, we have 3 compression rings. It's because it's a truck engine. So I'm going to take those gaps. Now, the book will very often tell you there's a specific orientation for these rings and they got to go in a certain spot. Well, that's kind of old school thinking as well, and here's why. Another thing I learned from Total Seal is that as the engine is running, because of the crosshatch, the rings, what they've discovered now, these rings are actually rotating as the engine runs. They rotate. So the main thing is not that these are at a specific location. The main thing is that they are staggered an even amount away from each other. We don't want those ring gaps lined up because then you're going to have blow-by both ways. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take these gaps now. I'm going to take and I'm going to move this one about 1/3 of the way over from here. It's about right here. Then I'm going to take the second one and I'm going to move it 1/3 of the way over the other way. And I'm going to leave that one there. So I've got one here, and one here. And so basically they're staggered an even amount around the piston. And if you have 2 of them, you just put them opposite each other. Because again, a lot of guys will say, well, you know, you need to put that in line with the pin, or you need to kind of go to the edge of the skirt, or whatever the book says. But the reality is that these rings are actually rotating on here. That's And you can research that and look into it if you want to, but it is actually what's happening. Okay, so back down to our engine here. I'm going to take WD-40, and I'm going to make sure that the bores are wiped out. I'm going to make sure that that's coated. I'm going to coat my skirt here and my rings with this WD-40. Pat it around there a little bit. Now another thing, once we get this in, you definitely do need to use assembly lube or oil on this pin. We haven't oiled that yet. And also on the bearings, we want to use oil. I use engine oil. Now you can use assembly lube on here. I like oil because I want to feel how the engine turns in its natural state. Now as far as the clearance goes down here, I didn't really talk about that, but I demonstrated that on the mains in the last video. As far as our clearance goes here, we're going to use the same procedure. And we already did this off camera, but what we're going to do is we're going to take our rod cap, we're going to put it on here, and we're going to torque it to specs. Then we're going to mic our crankshaft and set our dial bore gauge. And with this cap torqued on here, we're going to check the inside diameter of this with our bore gauge, just like we did with the mains. We've already done all that, and all our clearances are about 2.5 thousandths on these, so they're perfect. All right, so here is our cone style ring compressor. And this is what I talked to you about last time. So the way this works is the large side of the cone goes up, obviously, and we just take and we put this over our piston. We've got our rings staggered here, and we fit the rings down into the compressor. You got to kind of work these down in. And that's all there is to it. You basically, this compresses those rings as we go, and then we tap them in. Now if we look at the back side of the engine here, we've got our journal protectors on here. We just kind of push these onto the rod bolts there because we don't want those rod bolts to come down and damage this crank journal. So we've got one on top and one on bottom. And that's going to kind of, it also helps to kind of guide this in as we tap it in. So we just take and we tap our bearing down until we get that thing in there. Gently tap it down on over the crankshaft. And that keeps us from doing any kind of damage with the rod bolts to that crankshaft. Once we get to that point, and of course make sure that you put engine oil on your lower bearing assembly as well. Now keep in mind, it's important to understand that the notches, there's a notch here, that's a bearing notch to locate the bearing, and then also there's a number on here. Those notches are going to go to the same side of the rod. So here we've got our notches out here. We want to make sure that our notch here and our notch here is on the same side, and then of course both of our numbers are showing here. So we just take and very gently put our cap on there. And you might have to tap on this a little bit. Put your nuts on and torque them. Also, it's pretty critical. It's what you want to do is you want to take some oil. You want to make sure you oil these, the mating surface of the bolt here and these threads. Don't ever put those on dry because you'll get a false torque reading there. They got to be oiled. So the torque on the 305 connecting rod is 50 to 55 pounds. We're going to do that in 2 steps. I'm going to take and I'm going to set my torque wrench, my calibrated digital torque wrench. I'm going to set it for 35 pounds. And then I'm going to gently snug these up evenly. All right, there's 35, and then we're going to go ahead and go to our full torque. You always want to kind of pull these down in steps. You don't want to really get too crazy with it. And we're going to go to 55 foot-pounds. and do our final torque. Once you get it torqued, it's important, if you're going to let your torque wrench sit for any length of time, take the tension back off of it. Don't leave your torque wrench with tension on it because it damages the wrench. We've got our piston and rod assembly in the correct orientation. We've got our oil clearance right. We've got our bolts torqued. Now the next thing is, real important, make sure that you have adequate rod side clearance. And that's what this is here. This rod has to have movement, and I'm not sure how well this is going to show up, but I've got pretty decent movement there on that. But you have to check it with feeler gauges. Now the spec on this engine is 10 to 20 thousandths. And really, we're worried about it being too tight. So I'm going to put like an 11 thousandths in there, which is 1 thou above the minimum. And that should go in there. I'm going to push it over to one side, and it's going in. Okay, so I've got side clearance there. It's going in fairly easy. That's 11 thousandths. So it's above the minimum. And then I'm going to go to 20. You want to make sure that you don't have too much rod side clearance. I can tell just by feeling this, we definitely don't have too much. I've just done enough of these to know that it feels really good. But just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to go up to my 20 thousandths gauge, and I'm going to try to get it in there, and there ain't no way. So it's bigger than 10, it's smaller than 20, it's got good movement side to side, I can see it, I can feel it, it's within specs, you're good to go, you're golden on that. But you do have to make sure you check it. One of the things you got to watch out for is if you're building an engine and you have like a set of aftermarket rods or something like that, or you've got a different crankshaft that you exchanged, and this ends up being too tight here on the side clearance, big red flag. If you don't have enough side clearance, do not run that motor because you're going to wipe it out. So very, very important, got to have side clearance. The next thing is we want to rotate our engine and make sure that we don't have any binding. So we just want to take our rotation tool. Now keep in mind that every connecting rod and piston that you put in, it's going to create some resistance. And so it is going to be a little harder to turn, but you shouldn't find any place where it's binding or anything of that nature. It should turn over nice and smooth, and this is doing that. This feels really good. We don't have any binding issues here. Take a look at your piston on the top. Make sure that there's no rings scratching up the bore and it's going up and down nice and smooth. This one looks really good. Once you get all these in, another thing that we can do and that you should do is we want to check the deck clearance. This is our bridge gauge that we got from Powerhouse, and I think I've had this for many years, but it works great. It is magnetic. So the way that this works, if you want to check your deck clearance, and deck clearance is how far down below the surface this is sitting at top dead center. We just take our deck gauge here and we put it on a flat surface on the block, just like that, and we just zero this out on that flat surface, and then once we're zeroed out on this flat surface, we just take and we put this on the flat spot of the piston. Now, this piston has a slight dish in it. The flat spot is actually out here, so it's important that you get on the flat spot to get this clearance. So we're going to check it right there. And if you were actually doing a compression ratio or you were zero decking it, you'd actually have to check it here and here, but we're not going to worry about this because I think we have lots of deck clearance on this. This is a stock deck height here. And then you just come up to your highest point of travel. Now right there we're going down. You can see we're going down, so we're going to come up to our highest point of travel, and that's where it's topping out right there. So we have, now remember this gauge is getting bigger going this way. So we have 10, 20, what do we got here? We got about 28 thousandths deck clearance, which is perfectly fine. That's actually really good for this motor. So it looks good. So I am not going to insult your intelligence by filming every single piston going into this motor and make you suffer through that and watch it, okay? I think my audience is experienced enough, and most of you are sophisticated enough that you don't really need to see me put every single piston in. It is the same exact procedure for all of the rest of the pistons. Once I get all of the pistons in and get everything torqued, then we'll come back and we'll continue on with the build. If you really want to see every piston put in, I don't know, just rewind it and watch the segment where I put that piston in 6 times. I don't know. So once I get these in, I'll get them, we'll torque them up, and then we'll continue on. Now that we've got all 6 pistons in, we got everything torqued up. The engine's turning really nice. We don't have any kind of binding. We didn't really have any issues with it. So that segment is finished. One of the things that I would point out on the lower end here, and you'll notice this turns real nice, is we've got these torques. So the torque on the main caps, like just to reiterate this here, the torque on the main caps on this engine for installing the crank is 135 foot-pounds. The torque on the connecting rods is 55 foot-pounds. And you might notice I've put white paint on each one of these bolts. The reason I do that is simply because if I walk away from this thing like I'm going to, when I come back a day or two later or a week later or whatever, you know, I may not fully remember whether or not I torqued these. I can be fairly sure I did, but with an engine you can't be fairly sure. You have to be 100%. You have to know. So I always mark the bolts, the main bolts and the rod bolts, with white paint after I torque them. That way I know for sure that they're torqued when I come back to this thing, because this thing's going to get wrapped up in plastic until we the next segment when we start working on the heads and some other stuff. And this thing will probably sit for a couple of days or a week or whatever. And if I don't mark these when I come back, I'm probably going to have to get my torque wrench and double check them, because I may not be 100% sure that I torqued them. Because if you work on 4 or 5 motors in a week, you don't always remember. So it's a good practice to always put some paint markers or somehow mark these so you know that they're torqued. Well, that's going to do it for this segment of the 305 GMC V6 build. The lower end is together. I hope you enjoyed it. Next we're going to start working on the cylinder heads probably, and a few other little things in our next video, so stay tuned for that. Be sure to support this channel. If you like what you see here, go to www.patreon.com/myvintageiron. The address is right here below you, and it's also in the link. There's a link in the description. I do appreciate you watching. I'm asking for $1, $2, $10, $5, whatever per month for you to sign up. There's going to be extra content on the patron site. We also have some great giveaways, you guys, coming up on the 5th of February for you patrons. We have a performance cam and lifter kit that we are giving away. We're going to do a drawing amongst the patrons. Later on, we're giving away some cylinder heads. I have a set of fully built small block Chevy heads, a set of fully built Ford 390 FE heads. We have a toolbox down the road that we're giving away. We have a brand new welding helmet. There's all kinds of drawings and stuff coming up as long as that support comes in and we meet our goals. So stay tuned for the next video. I appreciate you watching, and I will talk to you very soon, I promise. Have a great day. Edit. Short block was completely put to... Edit. Hey guys, I wanted to add this in here real quick. Spoiler alert, this is our next build, or actually it's in line behind a few other ones. Or for those of you who are into Jeeps, we just picked up this core. It is a 4-liter inline 6-cylinder HO Jeep engine. We are going to do a Jeep, possibly a Jeep Stroker inline 4.0. So hopefully that intrigues you. Stay tuned, because this build is coming up.